Syria. Anything will get in the way of finding out what happened here. But we are duty-bound. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, we are duty-bound to find out this information on behalf of the American people. I applaud you. Mr. King, thank you for yielding the time, and I yield back.
And I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania and appreciate his presentation here on the floor. And I'd ask if he could stick around for a moment because I'm trying to do a little research of my own here, and that is that there's a patchwork of information that's been gathered together that among the American people. They have collectively within their memory and their records all that's publicly available. If we could go out and pull it together and consolidate it, then if we could organize it. This Congress is similar to that. We're representatives of the American people, and from each of our districts, each of our sets of responsibility and access to information, we can put together some of the puzzle here. But, you know, it's hard to put together a puzzle if you don't have the picture that's on the box. This administration has the box with the pieces and the picture on the box of the puzzle of what actually happened in Benghazi. And they knew it almost in real time. And they have been metering out the information as accepting or admitting to information as it was forced upon them, thanks to the media, thanks to people that have done real research. I recall a statement made to our gathering and our meeting that there weren't any wounded from the Benghazi incident out at Walter Reed Hospital. One of our members went out there and hung around the cafeteria until he found out otherwise and made personal contact and had deep conversations with at least one individual that was a survivor of Benghazi that was in a long-term rehab, Walter Reed. And so that's the level that we have to go to get an admission. And I wanted to ask the gentleman from Pennsylvania just a series of questions that clutter my mind. Have you seen a list of the survivors of Benghazi? Those survivors that Mr. Wolf talked about were picked up on the tarmac at the airport in Benghazi and flown out by a Libyan plane.
I have not seen the list.
Do you know the names of any of those 30-some survivors?
I do not.
And have you seen a timeline that shows what happened in Benghazi from beginning to end, one that is credible that you have confidence in?
Well, I certainly haven't seen anything that I have confidence in. There's been numerous ones put together, mostly by the side that wants to investigate this, trying to piece it together based on open source information.
Open source timeline. Have you seen any timeline of the Situation Room in the White House?
That we have no knowledge of anything in the Situation Room in the White House.
Just wondering, when the assault went on the compound that took out Osama bin Laden, and I would ask the gentleman, did you see any pictures from inside the Situation Room, and did you see a timeline of the events that took place on that assault?
Sure, the whole world saw that, and rightly so.
Exactly. And as I draw a comparison to Benghazi and the takedown of Osama bin Laden, those circumstances would have been similar, except that we initiated the operation against Osama bin Laden, so I presume there were some people that got invitations to go into the Situation Room and be there. We saw the looks of worry and concern on their faces. I remember the President there in the front of it. Secretary Clinton was there, and others in that setting. But we have no visuals of who was in the Situation Room during Benghazi. We have no timeline of who came into the room, who was in the room, who left the room, or when. And in that list would be when the President came, how long he was there, and when he left. We don't know the answers to that, even though everybody that was in the Situation Room would have known when the President arrived. They would have known when he left. They would have remembered precisely all dialogue that came from the President and almost all that went to the President. That's how I envision it. Would you envision that the same way, Mr.
That's exactly
Perry?
right.
And so the American people need to know this. Do you have any knowledge of who had custody of the body of Ambassador Stevens from the moment he was killed until such time as he turned up at the hospital in Benghazi?
Well, there's been some conflicting reports between, open source, between the rebels, and then he went to the hospital and was picked up by some of the folks from Tripoli, but then he wasn't there, and it's kind of, there's nothing congruent in that. I'm not sure the chain of custody regarding the ambassador's body. We're pretty sure we know what happened to it, and it's very unpleasant. But again, without an autopsy, we can't even be sure of that.
I would agree. And the individuals that delivered Ambassador Stevens' body to the hospital should be available to us. We should have been able to put them under oath and gather the record of what took place there. We don't know who had custody of Ambassador Stevens' body. We just know his body showed up at the hospital, and the balance of that is conjecture, although we've seen at least one picture of him being carried through the streets in a vertical way, and with no knowledge of whether he was alive or dead at that time. Most believe that he was dead at that time, but just simply don't know.
Right.
And can you imagine if it's your family member who had gone through this and to be locked out from the truth, if you'd lost one of the 4 lives that we lost in that, if you're one of those that are wounded and been muzzled, and the argument came out yesterday that the administration asserts that they have not commanded people to muzzle them to testify or to be quiet about what happened in Benghazi, and yet the intimidation factor, if your top officers lean on you and say, you've already taken a confidentiality oath, you better stick with that confidentiality oath. As a member of the former member of the armed services, if you're bound by confidentiality and you've already taken the oath, if your commander, your superior comes to you and says you've been involved in an incident, you're bound to that confidentiality. Would you honor that, Mr. Perry?
Well, in the interest of national security, you're in a dilemma. You've taken an oath and you do have a confidentiality requirement. However, I would also say there is a compelling reason for you to provide information to the American people and certainly to the Congress. I know that the Foreign Affairs Committee has set up hearings with some of these folks, and they have said they were coming and then miraculously and mysteriously declined between the time they said they were coming and the time they were supposed to appear. And so we're not sure why they would agree to it in the onset and then decide to change their mind hence. And so I think it's a very compelling question, but I think in the interest of finding out the truth that they would be compelled to testify under oath.
Do you believe that the attack by our enemies on our ambassador and the other victims was a planned attack or a spontaneous eruption?
There is no doubt. There is no doubt in America's mind, the world's mind, Libyan intelligence, they knew it within 24 hours. The fact that our ambassador, which, by the way, I must say that it besmirches her credibility, the President's credibility, the administration's credibility, including the recent activities regarding Syria and foreign policy and decision-making, to go out for weeks on end, including the President, and issue talking points that they clearly knew were false. They knew they were false. And the world knows they're false now. And most of the world knew they were false then. This was not a spontaneous eruption of violence, including RPGs and a coordinated attack. Coordinated attack requires planning. It requires resourcing. That didn't happen in a few moments' time over a video, which maybe that gentleman is even still in prison to this date. The only person that's been held accountable for this, I think, is arguably someone who had absolutely nothing to do with this.
Do you believe that the administration knew in real time that it was a planned attack on our ambassador and an assassination attempt?
Since the ambassador or the ambassador himself and his deputy both reported it was a real-time coordinated attack, not a spontaneous demonstration, I'm very certain in my heart and my mind that the administration knew what was happening.
You think Susan Rice knew when she went before the 5 television networks the following Sunday?
Again, we want to know who changed the talking points. I don't want to indict her if she was given the talking points, but at the level she was operating, she either should have known or corroborated the talking points. And so, to a certain extent, I think she's culpable, and it's reasonable to expect that she did know the talking points were changed and she was misleading the public.
And I would ask the gentleman from Pennsylvania if he attended the classified briefing Monday at 5 o'clock.
I did.
What level of confidence did that give you when you see that Ambassador Susan Rice there to lead the briefing?
Well, again, I suggest that the administration has a trust and confidence issue not only with this Congress but with the American people, and that is one of the reasons. You can't send somebody out at the top levels of government to provide information on such a sensitive issue as potentially going to war or an act of war whose credibility has been has been diminished by her own actions and the actions of this administration. So I think that trust and confidence has been eroded because of prior actions, particularly with Benghazi and Libya.
And I would agree wholeheartedly, Mr. Perry. And then this one remaining component of this topic that I think that you alluded to somewhat in your statement. The question is, what was Ambassador Stevens doing in Benghazi? And we've seen the announcement that came out last night or today that our administration is funneling weapons now into some elements of the Free Syrian Army. I'm concerned that those elements are the Muslim Brotherhood elements of the Free Syrian Army, but they have now announced that they're finally getting some resources in there. If that was the plan and the strategy to funnel weapons into the Free Syrian Army a year ago, that would have been a better strategy because the Muslim Brotherhood hadn't completely taken over that operation then. But some have speculated into the media, and we don't know because we haven't had a select committee that brought all this information out, that was part of the business that may have been taking place in Benghazi. And I don't have confirmation that that is the case, and I would ask the gentleman from Pennsylvania if you have seen any evidence that that might be the operation that was taking place and the reason that Ambassador Stevens was in Benghazi that day.
We've seen no evidence. We've been given no evidence. We have asked the questions directly and been denied.
And denied a straight answer to that.
Denied any answers.
Denied any answers. So what we know is that the administration immediately announced that it was a spontaneous eruption of a protest over a video. How they ever found that information to even be able to tie it to it, because it's completely disconnected and illogical. That they sent Susan Rice out before the American public, and in 5 networks she gave the same story. And now she's been awarded with the confidence of the President to advance her even more within this administration and set before the House of Representatives in a classified setting to lead us in the briefing on the Syrian, potential Syrian engagement. And so we know it wasn't a video. Do we know if the individual who actually produced that video is yet out of jail? Do you have any information on that?
He may be. I'm not sure. I must say I'm not sure. He may be out of jail, but I know he was held accountable at some point, and he literally did go to jail. And I would say it's arguable that he had absolutely anything to do with this or anything else.
And the last information I had was that he was still in jail. That's been some weeks ago. But I think he's a person you might be able to identify as a political prisoner at this point. It's unlikely that he would be in jail for his not meeting the parole requirements for this period of time, except for the politics that he got wrapped up into, Madam Speaker. So of all of these things that are inaccuracies and some of them outright dishonesties, there's been no question that this administration went out and willfully misinformed the American people. They did so in open source setting, the President's dialogue directly to the United Nations and multiple oblique references to a video. They knew in real time that it was a planned attack. There's a reason why we know that, and I know Mr. Perry knows that reason. And I'd ask you if you could tell us here why we know that it was a planned attack against our U.S. ambassador.
Well, like I said, you don't just bring heavy weapons like RPGs and things of the sort to a spontaneous eruption and demonstration. I mean, you must plan, like I said, it requires resourcing, ammunition. This thing went on for hours and hours and with heavy weapons. You just don't show up with a belt-fed weapon and the ammunition to support it on a whim. It requires, this is something that's heavy to carry. The ammunition's heavy to carry. It requires vehicles and people and coordination in what we call fields of fire, so you don't shoot the friendly, you only shoot the enemy. This coordination takes effort and time. It doesn't happen in a minute or two.
But don't we remember, well, I see at this moment we have some guests that have arrived, and I'd be happy to yield, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. The Chair will receive a message.
Madam Speaker, a message from the President of the United States.
Madam Speaker,
Mr. Secretary.
I am directed by the President of the United States to deliver to the House of Representatives a message in writing.
The gentleman from Iowa. Let me continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And picking up where we left off with this discussion about if it was a video that began this violence and it was a spontaneous demonstration that took place, I recall message that came out from the administration that Libya is a highly armed country and people walk around with AK-47s, or else they've got them very handy, and so if there's a violent demonstration, they can grab their AK-47 and run to the sound of the, not the guns, but the demonstration. And I don't disagree that that's a possibility in Libya. I know that it was a possibility in Iraq with the armament that they have or the weapons that they have in their homes. But we also know that there were RPGs there. We know that there were mortars there. We know that there were two locations. The first location where the attack took place, and then there was a fallback location, the secondary. One was the compound, one was the annex. We know that there were mortar rounds dropped in on the secondary location, and it looked like the sequence of that they had already dialed in that secondary location as a target. If that's the case, not only was it a planned attack, but it was a planned attack with intel that had the secondary location, the alternative location where they would retreat to once attacked in the primary location, already set up with mortars zeroed in on that. Does that fit with what you know from a military background? I'd ask the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Absolutely. A mortar is what we call an indirect fire method weapon that you don't necessarily have to see the target. You lob the round into the target, and so it requires coordination and known points of where the mortar is located versus where the target is located, and you have to shoot the right angle and the right azimuth. It's not just something that's done capriciously or quickly. There's a thing called a base plate which holds this mortar tube. It has to be carried. It usually takes several men or a vehicle depending on the size of the mortar. And then there's the ammunition that comes in cases. It's not something that you just carry around in your pocket. It's heavy, and you're not just shooting one. So multiple cases, again, logistics and support for this, planning for this, and of course, like you said, the planning on multiple locations of attack. They would have to know that. They would have to know the location of where it is, of course, and where their firing point was for the best field of fire and security from opposing fire. And, of course, I think the ambassador, he described all this in his phone calls. And, of course, our troops on the ground, some of them who perished, lasered the target, expecting support from the United States, from what they knew. You never go without knowing who your support's going to be, what your backup plan is. And they fully expected, these folks fully expected some guided munitions to come take out the assault, but it never came. And so there's no doubt in my mind that this was a coordinated, well-prepared attack, and there's also no doubt in my mind that the administration knew this very early on. Maybe if they didn't know it within 24 hours, they certainly knew it within the span of a week. But the misleading of the American public went on for weeks. For weeks.
If a gentleman were going to set up a mortar and zero in on a target, what would be the minimum number of rounds that it would take to have confidence that you could zero in on, say, the top of a building?
Well, a mortar is a somewhat inspecific. It's what we call an area weapon, so it never is. You never really get. You're not going to shoot a mortar into a window. But what they fire them, they sometimes shoot long, they shoot over, or they shoot short, and so they bracket it. They adjust the tube back and forth until they get it to the range. But if you have a known point that you're firing from and a known point that you're firing to, you can do that with much greater accuracy in much less time. And I would suggest that they had that all figured out when they showed up, which is how they were able to deliver rounds on the target immediately.
And I would ask the gentleman if the third mortar round was the fatal round for two of our brave Americans. Would that indicate that that mortar had been set up and planned in advance? Absolutely.
You must know that it takes multiple, what we call registration rounds and so on and so forth, to bracket a target. Multiple iterations of firing the tube or the mortar to hit the target. I'm talking half a dozen times. And it's very precise. So they knew exactly what they were doing. They had this planned well in advance, in my opinion.
And we would have known that in almost real time, and the Situation Room in the White House would be what I would say, and yet still people went out and made the story that it was a movie. And then after the story of the movie began to break down, it became, well, it was actually a spontaneous response because people came running with the weapons that they had, and we'd have gotten more truth out in this dialogue that we've had here in this past 45 minutes on the floor of the House of Representatives and has willingly been brought forward by this administration. And I have said that what Benghazi is worse than Watergate. I think that's a very easy position to hold in that Watergate was a burglary that the president found out about afterwards, and it was wrong for President Nixon to seek to cover that burglary up. It cost him the presidency, and it cost America dearly in the events of history that unfolded from that. But this is something that goes deeper and worse. I believe it was a planned assassination attack on our ambassador. And I believe that we had a whole group of historic Americans who conducted themselves very well, and they deserve to be identified if they want to be, and they deserve the respect and the appreciation and the honor that the American people would like to give them. And the best thing we can do for the memories of those that are lost is to provide the full truth, and the full truth that goes outside that must be classified. And as history moves on, classification changes because the relevance of the need for it to remain secret also changes. So perhaps today we can pick up the momentum to get those final signatures on the Wolf resolution, get to the point where we can convince our Speaker that we need to have this special select committee to investigate Benghazi, that it incorporates the top people from the 5 committees that have jurisdiction, to do those kind of hearings with a significant budget, or we can make sure that it's well-staffed, and subpoena the people that we need to, put that record out into the public eye and the public ear, record that record, and build that and put it into a bound copy, a version which says this is the reasoned judgment of Congress, these are the facts as they can be gathered, and that has been scrutinized by the public in real time. If we do that, we can draw our conclusions, historians will be able to draw their conclusions, and we can do honor to those that lost their lives, gave their lives for us, and we can do honor to those who have suffered serious wounds, and we can do honor to those who were in that conflict, and we can clean this up to the point where all of those that serve us in the foreign service and put their lives on the line, and there have been, by my recollection, 8 ambassadors who have lost their lives in the line of duty or died while they're in service of our country over the course of the history of the United States. 8, Ambassador Stevens, the most recent, the most violent, but also the one that they have the most questions about. And you know, this was going to be an open administration, one of the most transparent in history, and now we have the Secretary of State who presided over this, who was the lead voice, the one who should have given us the most direct response, has not given us a full testimony. She did appear before a Senate committee, and it was a limited amount of testimony, but she has not come clean with this. And as we see this situation of the cover-up of the facts of Benghazi, we're also seeing the people that are engaged in this, that do know the facts, asking for an even higher level of responsibility and leadership. In fact, all the way to the White House seems to be the direction that the former Secretary of State would like to take. And I'm going to suggest, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, that this can't happen in America. You cannot have someone who covered up something worse than Watergate find a path to go back to the White House and then put this country back under another shield to hide information, to cover up. The American people deserve the truth. One of the strengths that we have as a nation is because we have been willing to face the real truth, face the real realities, and brace up and take on the enemies within the world. And the people that serve this country and do so with dignity and honor and nobility are those in uniform, but it isn't only those in uniform. It's those that are in the CIA. It's some of the civilian contractors that have served in our military. They're also part now as civilian security detail. There are those in the State Department that know they're out there on the edge and on the end. And we need to honor all of them by bringing the truth out. There are many people, especially within the State Department and the CIA, who are sick at heart because they know the real truth. We need to give them an opportunity to bring that real truth out. And I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Well, you're absolutely right, Mr. King, and as you already stated, the American people deserve to know. It was scarcely 6 weeks ago I talked to some of the families of the fallen who have not, since that fateful day well, it's a year ago now, then it was just nearly a year, have still not gotten any answers from the administration. As a matter of fact, the administration doesn't talk to them at all. They're coming into Congress asking us to find answers, and I would ask the American people, is that how you want the people that serve this country overseas in very dangerous situations to be treated? Some of these are former military members serving in this capacity of security detail for the ambassador, or that just picked up and went to the fight, even though they were told not to, and gave their lives. Their lives were taken from them, and this is how their families are being treated. They're dead, and their families are getting no resolution They're getting no closure on this thing, and it's at the hands of this federal government and this administration. It's reprehensible, and it can be stopped immediately if they would just answer the questions that we have, that all Americans have.
And reclaiming my time, I'd say a few more words, Madam Speaker, that I sat through a series of briefings over the last week or a little better in different places around the world. And in one of those briefings, one of our Special Operations Forces personnel made a point that they were ready to go to Benghazi. There's nobody there that trains that isn't ready. Nobody's reluctant to step in and serve, no matter how dangerous the mission, no matter what the prospects are of success. If there are Americans in trouble and they are given the green light and that's the order to go into battle, they don't hesitate, they don't shrink back, they don't think, I wish I wasn't here. They train for that. And as they train for that, there's no hesitation. So we should always know that our military men and women, our security personnel, there's no hesitation on their part. They wanted to be there, and that's why when they got the order to stand down at the third time, they went anyway, because these are brethren that needed to be protected. The gentleman.
And I would ask, Mr. King, we were told that there wasn't adequate time, that reinforcements and help was too far away. How did the administration know how long this was going to take? How long this attack was going to go on for? Because when the calls came from the ambassador, it was hours and hours later till he perished, until others perished. And during that period of time, we could have sent people on their way. Maybe they would have never gotten there in time, and maybe that's still a failure in planning. But I think the American people could forgive the mistake with the effort. But the effort wasn't made at all, and I wonder who made the determination that this is going to end in 2 hours or 3 hours or 10 hours or 10 minutes and said, no, we're not going to send anybody because it's going to be over. How did they know that? I would suggest they never knew that, because they never had any intention of sending anybody, because they never had any plan, they never expected this, they never wanted this, and they hoped it would go away quietly into the night. That's what I would suggest.
Well, in reclaiming my time, it appears to me that there was a political decision that was made in the Situation Room in the White House, and that political decision was, we're in a tough, tight re-election battle. This is September 11th. We are less than 2 months before the election date. This could become the whole pivotal issue that the election is decided upon. Let's see if we can slide this thing down and tamp it under the rug, and maybe it'll go away. Maybe it won't be as big or as bad as we fear that it is. And that's the question that comes back. There's a time in this job to do your duty. There's a time in this political arena that we're in that you set aside politics. There's a time when you look at your re-election and you decide, my job here in this moment doing the right thing is more important than any prospects of how people will vote 2 months from now or a year or more from now. That's that sense of duty. That's why we take an oath to uphold this Constitution. There's an oath. We all stand here on the floor of this House and take this oath to preserve, protect, and defend this Constitution of the United States. The President does so. The executive branch personnel do so. And when I look back through history, I can think of no time that our leadership in the White House has decided that the political calculation was more important than the lives of an ambassador that had an opportunity to be saved. And maybe we would not have been able to save the ambassador. Maybe we could have saved 2 of the others that were killed later in that operation. But we could have at least been there to send that message and to intimidate. And we're now, a year and a day later, the press has identified some of the perpetrators. They've gone to Benghazi and sat down and had lunch and interviewed them. There are at least 3 media networks that have interviewed 1 or more of these perpetrators. If we know who they are and justice was going to be brought to them, why hasn't that been the case? Why hasn't this administration acted? Meanwhile, they will tell us they know exactly how to put a precision strike in on Assad in Syria to send just the right message that won't tip the balance of power and change the result of the civil war in Syria, but it will give him the message that he won't use weapons of mass destruction again. They have enough intel to apparently do that, but not enough intel to just follow the reporters around in Benghazi and collar the people that they talk to. That would be just that simple. And furthermore, the intel that seems to have identified the elements of the Free Syrian Army. I would just say a few words about that I've gathered as I've circumnavigated this globe and sat down in on a whole series of meetings that took place that you put the pieces of the puzzle together on the intel with Syria and in Egypt and others. And just on the Syria side, we had a a free Syrian army that emerged. It emerged as a popular uprising against Assad for his cruel and evil dictatorship of his people and for killing some of his own people, even then as political enemies. And the Free Syrian Army emerged. And so they should have easily been the people that we supported. Well, as that battle went on, they were taking over different areas within Syria, tactical objectives and communities and cities and large geographical areas of Syria. And at a certain point, the Muslim Brotherhood stepped in. They took over some parts of the Free Syrian Army. They set up an operation that essentially sacrificed the leader of the Free Syrian Army. He was captured in an operation where he was sacrificed. They took him out of command. His successor commander now has been marginalized and pushed off to the side, and the Free Syrian Army, the knowledge that I have, is now controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood and other radical Islamist entities, including Al-Qaeda. And that's the entity that we are now have a good enough intel that we are starting to send supplies and military supplies into. Those two entities, Assad and radical Islamist-controlled components, which is a large component of the Free Syrian Army, they're the bad guys. They're both our enemies. And yet the administration is in the business now, a year after that should have been happening in an aggressive way, arming some of the wrong people. And it's not that we didn't have good choices. There still are good choices. There still are good people in Syria and outside Syria that will step forward that want to have a secular Syria, a Syria that has freedom of religion, a Syria that is run by the people of Syria. Those elements are still there in Syria and around Syria, at least 2 million Syrian refugees. That force can be put together. It takes longer than firing a cruise missile into Damascus and picking a target to send a pinprick message. It can be done, but I'm not confident that this administration has identified our friends. What I have seen is that when we've aligned with anybody in the Middle East, it's been the Muslim Brotherhood. And whenever we've had 2.5 years of the Arab Spring, and in every break that's changed the power within the countries in North Africa, the Middle East, and every break has gone in favor of the Muslim Brotherhood, except one. And that is now, when the Muslim Brotherhood took over Egypt, under Morsi, 30 to 33 million people came to the streets in a popular demonstration, the largest demonstration in the history of the world, to unseat Morsi because they don't have a constitutional way to impeach him. They didn't have a way to arrest him. The only thing they can do is go to the streets and demand that he be removed from power. Our administration sent a message before Morsi came to power that Mubarak had to be gone yesterday. Remember that word? He needs to be gone yesterday. Well, that upset the balance of power in Egypt. That helped Morsi come to power. Morsi squeaked by winning an election with 5.8 million people voting for him out of 83 million or so Egyptians altogether. Now it's exactly what you'd call a majority of the people supporting Morsi. Morsi's complete incompetence, but also his very bold moves to consolidate power within Egypt to where it became clear that there was not going to be another election in Egypt, and the Muslim Brotherhood was going to impose Sharia law, and you start seeing that happen. Well, 30 to 33 million people in the streets of Egypt, and the Egyptian military stepped forward to support the popular uprising that took place, and now they have laid out a timeline, a roadmap to write a constitution, put a constitution out on a public vote to ratify, and then to elect a president and a civilian government. And they have pledged, General al-Sisi has pledged, to turn over this military control of the Egyptian government to a newly elected legitimate civilian government. That timeline is a good timeline, and it's a good commitment that has been set up, and it's a good result. But the problem we have is that our administration was against Mubarak and helped push him out of power, and that helped open the door for Morsi, who came in, and one of the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's clear this new leadership, the interim president of Egypt, the General al-Sisi, commanding the military, and also, by the way, they have the support of the Pope of the Coptic Christian Church in Egypt. All of that, the new forces are clear. They oppose the Muslim Brotherhood. The struggle within the Middle East, the Muslim Brotherhood, radical Islam, radical violent Islamist groups working against the free people in that part of the world. We need to be on the right side of everyone, not on the wrong side of everyone. And the administration is going to have to turn their course around in Egypt and get behind the new administration and support new elections and a new constitution. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I'd like to pose a question to you based on what you've seen regarding Syria and Benghazi and Libya, the classified briefings and your travels. Why is it that we look to punish Syria after this administration reported to us that Syria had used chemical weapons 11 times previously, and on the 12th time we want to send a message that that's not okay, and it's not okay. Let's be clear about that. But why didn't we send a message, and why haven't we sent a message that it's not okay to kill a United States ambassador? When is that message going to be sent? And I'd just like to get your thoughts on that and the dichotomy and the lack of parallel in some kind of strategy and foreign policy that is congruent and makes sense to our allies and our adversaries.
Well, I would just say to the gentleman that he's pointed out a stark contradiction in our policy. 11 or 12 times of alleged, at least, weapons of mass destruction used against the Syrian people. I'm going to suggest that this push now is because some of the people that want those elements of the Free Syrian Army that I described to succeed are saying help us out by landing a strike or two in on Assad. That's my guess. But with regard to justice for the people that perpetrated the Benghazi incident against our Americans and our American ambassador, that justice needs to be delivered. We know who some of those people are, and it's irresponsible of this administration to shut information down to the United States Congress, to the American people, and to fail to act when they have a clear act of war committed against the United States on U.S. territory. I'm aware that the clock has ticked down here to the end. I want to thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania for coming to the floor. I'm sure that he wasn't aware that this wasn't choreographed. It was a spontaneous eruption of protest calling for the truth to come out and the light to shine on Benghazi. I thank the gentleman from Virginia for his leadership on this, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair would remind members to direct their remarks to the chair. The chair leads before the House a message.
74C of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2013, Public Law 112-239, January 2, 2013, I hereby transmit principles for modernizing the military compensation and retirement systems requested by the Act, signed Barack Obama, the White House, September 12, 2013.
Referred to the Committee on Armed Services and ordered printed. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the House adjourns, I want to note that when we come back, we will be 5 days before the end of the fiscal year. That could bring a shutdown of the federal government. What most Americans don't know is that that could bring a shutdown also of the government of the nation's capital, the District of Columbia. I want to make clear that there's not a single member of this House or of the Senate who desires that outcome. There's nothing in that for anybody. In fact, many members of Congress and their staff actually live in the District of Columbia, so to have the nation's capital shut down is not anything that would even be in their interest. Beyond their own interest, most members of Congress believe in local control and are mystified when they come here, whatever their party, to find that the Congress has anything to do with the local budget of the District of Columbia, $8 billion raised by the city, which has to come here before the city can spend a dime of its own money. Now, the city has, before the Congress as I speak, a balanced budget. In fact, a budget that has won plaudits all around the country and even in this Congress because of the fund balance that the city has managed to build over $1 billion over time. Its very middle name should be prudence. So If anything, the District of Columbia has been an example of what we're trying to get cities and states all across the country to do. I understand why the leadership decided not to move forward with a congressional resolution which would have guaranteed that the government would remain open until December 15th. They need the time to get the votes and to satisfy their members. That's perfectly understandable. What would not be understandable is if we went through another shutdown crisis. The government actually did shut down about 18 years ago, and I do want to say here on the floor how grateful I am to the Speaker of the House at the time, Newt Gingrich, who indeed kept the District of Columbia, the nation's capital, open during multiple shutdowns of the federal government. And he did so simply because it makes no sense to shut down the government of the nation's capital, who has not 1 ounce of interest in or blame for the dispute that has increasingly grown more often and has caused us to go on congressional resolutions because we do not get our bills done in time. And so there needs to be time to reconcile those matters. And it's important to note that the District of Columbia budget, which was submitted here on time, is in such good shape that it, in fact, did pass both of the appropriation committees that received it. So there's no issue here involving the District of Columbia, no reason why anybody would want it entangled in a federal dispute. In fact, I thought that my good friends in the majority, above all, stood for disentanglement of the federal government in what should rightly be the work of the localities. So I hasten to say this is an unintended consequence that comes from the fact that most members don't even know it. Members come here to do the business of their district in the federal government. They don't come here to be educated on the District of Columbia. So they have no idea that the district would close down if there was a close down of the district. But they would understand that I must do my job, and that is to take whatever steps I can to make sure that this unintended result does not occur. I'm asking to testify at the Rules Committee when the congressional resolution is considered. That is the resolution, as I indicated, that would keep the government open until December the 15th. It's interesting to know that with only a slight change, the District of Columbia would not be an issue here. I want to thank the Republican appropriators who, it must be at least 10 years ago, corrected another consequence that the Congress never intended. The district budget used to be held up whenever the budget, of course, of the federal government was held up, and for the very same reason that it hadn't come to the floor. So you had a city whose budget was due out by September 30th, which sometimes got out in November or December. This wreaked havoc on the opening of schools, on the ability of the city to contract because the budget was over here and hadn't been passed. It's important also to lay on the record that the budget doesn't come here because any member of the Congress is interested in the budget or thinks that their oversight is necessary to make sure that the budget is done correctly. In fact, the budget is virtually never looked at. What does happen when the budget comes here is that extraneous amendments that reflect the views not of the District of Columbia, but of the member who's offering it, often are attached to our budget. But the Appropriation Committee has never interfered with the budget itself. How could they? The budget has been put together from subcommittees and committees, and it has a chief financial officer, the only jurisdiction in the United States that has a financial officer appointed for 5 years, cannot be fired except for cause, who has to pass on the budget and to make sure that there is no overspending. But it comes here out of tradition. It comes here because for more than 200 years it has come here while the Congress has been trying to figure out how to deal with the anomalous position that it has put its nation's capital in. So here it is. And in order to avoid the budget getting out so late that you cripple or certainly make extremely difficult the ability of the city officials to run a big, complicated city, the appropriators agreed upon a small change, and I'm asking us to act on that already existing change. That change says that in every CR, there will be, no matter what the CR says, and most CRs say very little, but the district will be allowed to spend its own funds at the levels that have been approved by its council and by the Congress at next year's level. And that has had enormously important good effects on the city. We will be in that CR in the same way. But as the district's member of Congress, I have to contemplate the possibility, at least, that even on December 15th, the government could close down, and I'd have to indeed look at what would be even perhaps better, that it didn't close down, but there was yet another CR. Imagine trying to run a big city in the United States on multiple CRs. That's what I'm trying to avoid. That's what no member of Congress intends. Now, I also have had to take precautions for the possibility that even the CR that comes before us, I'm hoping next week, could fail. If that CR fails, I also have a bill that would allow the district to run whenever the federal government shuts down, this year and in perpetuity. Again, if I am right that there is no member who would like to shut down any local jurisdiction, and especially the nation's capital, then I think the bill would take care of it. The reason I have to go to Rules Committee for the CR is that is the next step. That's the next opportunity to draw this matter to the attention of the House and to, therefore, by amendment, allow the district to spend for the entire fiscal year, not from CR to CR, but for the entire fiscal year. I don't think that is asking too much, and I've never had an objection when I've tried to keep the district open. But it has been difficult to do. 3 times the district almost shut down in recent history because we got that close to it. Now, the problem for the city when the city almost closes down runs up to being like when it does close down, because the city can't assume the best. It has to assume the worst. So it has to call out its staff and its lead officials to prepare for a shutdown, even if a shutdown does not occur. So the only responsible thing for the city to do right now, with only 5 days left in, at least as it now stands, because there's to be recess beginning at the end of the month. So we've got to assume the status quo, and we've got to assume the worst because it would be irresponsible not to. So in addition, I have to put in a bill, that's in addition to the amendment that would allow the district to remain open. To illustrate just how unintended would be a shutdown, the House needs to know that the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, on which I sit, has passed a bill that would give the district more autonomy over its local budget and, importantly, would keep the district from shutting down. That bill now is pending and could come to the floor at any point. The President of the United States has in his budget a shutdown avoidance bill for the district. And the Senate Appropriation Committee has the same language in its bill. The House appropriators have taken the position that they do not believe the district should be shut down. Of course, they bow to the authorizers, and as indicated, the Oversight Committee has legislation that has been voted out of the committee that is now pending. I think any member who has held local office, and by the way, I did not hold local office before I came to Congress. Therefore, those who have held local office have, I think, a better idea of what such a threat means to a local jurisdiction and how much it is at odds with what both sides understand to be the American approach to federalism, where local jurisdictions get to run their own localities and states, and by the way, get to raise their own funds. That is what the district has done, and it has done it well. These frequent shutdown threats have had a very disruptive effect on the city and on its employees and on its residents. And it does something that we, I'm sure, appreciate no elected official wants to have happen. It casts a pall of uncertainty right when you are looking forward to a budget for the coming year. That kind of uncertainty already has had its effects. Wall Street, for example, understands that the district's budget is not final until it somehow is passed out of the Congress. The district pays a premium, pays a price for that, because there are two bodies, not one, two bodies that get a say over its local budget. No city should ever have to wonder whether it'll be shut down. The shutdowns really don't occur at the local level because residents won't let it occur. They are close enough to the people so that is not a threat you could much get away with at the local level. Here we are, some levels above that. And most members and most Americans don't know that there is a local legislation that is put in that peril as I speak. The district has About 630,000 residents. It's growing well. People are moving into the city, not out. There are cranes all over town, and much of this comes out of the excellent management of the city, out of the way the city has conducted its economic affairs, out of the fact that it has an independent chief financial officer who cannot be fired because he disagrees with the council or the mayor and therefore has to tell the truth. It's all worked together to make the district the kind of jurisdiction that the Congress, at least, should have no concern about, and I believe has no concerns about. The price the district would pay is hard for me to make clear to members, because it would have to occur before they felt it. We have come close to feeling it, and almost 20 years ago we did in fact feel it. There are some parts of your some parts of your services to the people that continue, but huge parts cannot, because the Congress has not passed the budget, not because the Congress objects to the budget, and not because any member of this House desires that outcome. This House does not mean to hold the district budget as hostage. If it did, there's something the district could do to get out of this hostage fight. So what makes this so frustrating is that there's nothing we can give, nothing we can do to extricate ourselves from a fight that is wholly inside baseball within this chamber and the chamber across the way. To be sure, I have contacted my Senate allies, but frankly this has to be done here. We've got to get agreement on both sides of the aisle to the simple proposition that those of us who believe in the great and important freedoms of the framers would least want to be held responsible for closing down a local jurisdiction, one with which we had no beef. This country was established on a pedestal of federalism. One thing we understand is the difference between a local jurisdiction and its rights and responsibilities and ours. If anything, there are members of this chamber who would want some of what the government does no longer done by the federal government at all, but in fact to be the work of the local jurisdictions. Many in this chamber not only support but indeed believe that the local jurisdictions do a better job at governing than any institution at the federal level. I can therefore find no set of principles here from any member of Congress that would be in play when the decision is made on my amendment to the congressional resolution or on the bill pardon me, that I will introduce as a fallback in case it does not occur. As we go home, perhaps earlier than expected, to ponder what to do with keeping the federal government open, I ask that members bear in mind that there would be closing not only of federal agencies but of the District of Columbia government. And in the name of the people of the District of Columbia, I ask you, wherever we stand on the federal government, to allow the District of Columbia to move forward to govern itself and to take care of its day-to-day business. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Hawaii seek recognition?
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Hawaii seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to be removed as a co-sponsor of H.R. 281.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A couple of issues that certainly are worth elaborating on today. One is codified in the Wall Street Journal article from September 11th, yesterday, 7:35 p.m. is when it's timed out, regarding IRS Supervisor Lois Lerner. Article's entitled Lois Lerner's Own Words. The article says Congress's investigation into the IRS targeting of conservatives has been continuing out of the Syria headlines, and it's turning up news. Emails unearthed by the House Ways and Means Committee between former Director of Exempt Organizations Lois Lerner and her staff raised doubts about IRS claims that the targeting wasn't politically motivated and that low-level employees in Cincinnati masterminded the operation. The article says in a February 2011 email, Ms. Lerner advised her staff, including then Exempt Organizations Technical Manager Michael Sato and then Rulings and Agreement Director Holly Paz, that a Tea Party matter is, quote, very dangerous, unquote, and is something, quote, counsel and Lerner advisor Judy Kendall need to be in on, unquote. Ms. Lerner adds, quote, Cincy should probably not, the word not, all capitalized, have these cases, unquote. That's a different tune than the IRS sang in May when former IRS Commissioner Stephen Miller said the agency's overzealous enforcement was the work of 2 rogue employees in Cincinnati. When the story broke, Ms. Lerner suggested that her office had been unaware of the pattern of targeting until she read about it in the newspaper. Quote, so it was pretty much we started seeing information in the press that raised questions for us, and we went back and took a look, unquote, she said in May. And, Mr. Speaker, so no one misunderstands, it is a crime to give false information to Congress. The article goes on. Earlier this summer, IRS lawyer Carter Hull, who oversaw the review of many Tea Party cases and questionnaires, testified that his oversight began in April of 2010. Tea Party cases came under review are, quote, being supervised by Chip Hull at each step, unquote, Ms. Paz wrote to Ms. Lerner in a February 2011 email. Quote, he reviews info from TPs, or Tea Parties, correspondence to TPs, etc. No decisions are going out of Cincy until we go all the way through the process with the C3 and C4 cases here, unquote. Article goes on. The emails also put the targeting in the context of the media and congressional drumbeat over the impact of conservative campaign spending on the 2012 elections. On July 10th, 2012, Then Lerner advisor Sharon Light emailed Ms. Lerner a national public radio story on how outside money was making it hard for Democrats to hold their Senate majority. It certainly appears that the IRS was weaponized for the political purpose of one party, which would, of course, be one of the worst nightmares for the founders of this country. Of course, George Washington didn't even want us to have political parties. He warned of the danger there. And here we are, all this time later, with a group of Democratic operatives doing things with the IRS that Richard Nixon could only dreamed of doing. This article from Wall Street Journal goes on, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee had complained to the Federal Election Commission that conservative groups like Crossroads GPS and Americans for Prosperity should be treated as political committees rather than 501c4s, which are tax-exempt social welfare groups that do not have to disclose their donors. Quote, perhaps the FEC will save the day, unquote, Ms. Lerner wrote back later that morning. Having been a district judge presiding over criminal cases, that is what you would call, Mr. Speaker, a statement against interest by Ms. Lerner in a prior communication that directly contradicts what she said the motivation was. I think there are criminal implications here that need to be followed up. In any event, the article goes on that response suggests Ms. Lerner's political leanings. It also raises questions about Ms. Lerner's intentions in a separate email exchange she had when an FEC investigator inquired about the status of the conservative group, the American Future Fund. The FEC and IRS don't have the authority to share that information under 6103 of the Internal Revenue Code. But the bigger question is, why did they want to? After the FEC inquiry, the American Future Fund also got a questionnaire from the IRS. Again, that's from the Wall Street Journal, dated last night. When one party in power in the executive branch can weaponize its federal agencies against its political opponents, unless it is stopped, this little experiment in democracy will come to an end. It will bring about the very things, again, that the founders had hoped would not happen, but were realistic enough to talk about them at some length about when and if we might move to one person being able to grasp control of the federal government. And of course, one of the things they used to try to keep that from happening was to give Congress the power of the purse, to give Congress oversight over the executive and judicial branches. And when we have Congress try to do oversight, whether it's over Fast and Furious, Benghazi, the IRS scandal, we've met with nothing but blinded opaqueness, not transparency from this administration. They have obfuscated constantly, done everything they can to prevent Congress from getting the truth about what they have called even phony scandals. Well, if they're so phony, why don't you get the transparency out here, Mr. Speaker? Let's get people out here with the truth, and then we can see fully whether or not they're phony scandals. But the more this drip, drip, drip of information comes out, the more it becomes clear as to why this administration has been hiding evidence and attempting to keep Congress from discovering things. I have personally been pushing for many months now to have a special prosecutor investigate the Internal Revenue Service situation with regard to targeting for political purposes. The reason is that there are statutes that pertain to the IRS that could make some of this conduct potential crimes for which people could go to prison. I am so proud that I became a friend of Chuck Colson before he passed. I think he is one of the great Christian luminaries of the 20th and 21st century. And his becoming a Christian all came about after his arrogance and his willful disobedience of the law during the Nixon administration brought him to prison. He had possession of information from the FBI about someone, and as I recall, that got him about 1.5 years in prison. Yet we have seen during the close of the Clinton years as president, one man having at the White House about 1,000 FBI files. If he had been held to the same standard as Chuck Colson, he would never have gotten out of prison. But nobody went to prison. And we've seen, as time has gone on, and abuses within the executive branch have not been dealt with properly. The abuses have continued and gotten worse. And from reports I hear from conservative groups, whether Tea Party, pro-Israel, pro-marriage, as it's been known for the history of mankind, between a man and a woman, groups that just wanted the Constitution followed, all coming under attack. Not all of the groups have, but most of the groups that have been these type of groups. From the IRS. Then I hear from others who are being hit by inquiries from the FEC, not about Democratic matters, but about contributions to the Republican candidates and party. And then we hear that the EPA and other federal agencies are going after conservatives. It is unbelievable how powerful this government has gotten and how dramatically it can affect the outcome of an election. We must make sure that these kind of abuses stop. We have the power of the purse to stop it, and we should. And if the administration is not going to be forthcoming with information about the IRS, then it may be necessary to defund part of the executive branch until such time as they become truthful. The Department of Justice still has not been forthcoming on information that in our Judicial Committee we've been trying to get. We still haven't gotten answers to all of the matters that ended up resulting in the Attorney General of the United States being held in contempt for failing and refusing to answer. And it would seem that in the Fast and Furious scandal, where this administration saw to it that 2,000 or so guns made their way into the hands of drug cartels in Mexico, resulting in the losses of hundreds of lives in Mexico, and at least one or more here in the United States, that someone should be held to account. When no one is held to account, when there is no accountability, the abuses get worse. And that's what we're hearing. You would have thought once the IRS scandal had been exposed that people would be more cautious about going after conservative groups for political purposes. But since no one has been held accountable yet, no budget's cut, this arrogance and the political maneuvering within federal agencies seems to be growing much worse. I'm hoping that my friends on the other side of the aisle will understand that the pendulum swings back and forth. And I cannot imagine a single of my Democratic friends across the aisle being near as composed as we've been on the Republican side of the aisle about the abuses, if the shoe were on the other foot, and those abuses were over Democratic groups that were trying to elect the next Democratic president. And if they were, I should be helping the Democrats, and I would help the Democrats, because there's no place for an administration that weaponizes, for political purposes, the agencies under its control. We've gone for over 200 years fighting and doing what we could to avoid that happening, yet here it's happening. And it is a federal agency I want to go to next that's been involved in carrying out the will of this administration. An article from yesterday from Breitbart, written by John Sexton, where he says it's been nearly a year since the attack which killed 4 Americans in Benghazi. During that time, various minute-by-minute accounts of the attack have been published. In addition, the administration's decisions to refuse additional security requests and to revise its talking points after the attack have been examined in detail. And, Mr. Speaker, before I go on, I would like to grab a couple of posters.
Grabbing some posters.